Hello, welcome to Sacred Assumptions. My name is Alaric. I have a bachelor's degree in geology.
I'm Ben, and I have a bachelor's degree in apologetics.
And for this session, we're going to go over 1 Peter 4:12 through 9. And then we'll have other discussions later on in this discussion. It will be in a separate episode. And these sort of conversations are for like casual conversations, questioning modern beliefs, so that y'all can have good conversation starters and toss around ideas. All right. So with that, I will start us off with reading our verse section for this episode. 1 Peter 4:12 through 19. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trials when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice in so far as you share Christ's suffering, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because of the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. Let none of you suffer as a murderer, or a thief, or an evildoer, or as a meddler. Yet, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome of those who do not obey the gospel of God? If the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinners? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. What is something that stands out to you at first?
Says not to think that a fiery trial is something strange that's happening to you. Mostly just because there's a belief that, if if you're under trial or something problematic is happening to you, then you're not having proper faith in God, that things should be going well.
The mentality of I'm being obedient so I get blessings. Or,
along those lines, like prosperity gospel type of stuff.
Yeah. That those who are in God don't face hardships.
Right.
But here it's saying like, no, you will face trials. And all in your life. Later on, it will go with suffering. That there's a difference between, I'd say, suffering and trials. This one seems to be the part where that the first part for a trial is testing your faith and suffering. And not to be surprised when the trials come. Because people will probably believe that suffering, like, yeah, of course something's going to be, you've done something at first and now you have this suffering. Well, trials are God just testing you and not the part where you have disobedience beforehand.
So you're saying that, or after you mentioned, don't act like the fiery trial is something that is strange is happening to you, but rejoice insofar as you share Christ and share Christ's sufferings, that the suffering is different than the trial?
Now that I'm reading, double checking right there, that's probably different than what I just said. There is suffering in the fiery trial. Because most of the time when I think about it, I think of like James, where there's a difference, where James puts a difference there. Luke Peter, I'm guessing that, recorrecting myself, that there'll be some suffering in some trials.
Right. And those like part of what it's also, well, at least what I would imagine it's suggesting here. Well, I guess because it does go on to, because it says initially, or it says, rejoice in the sufferings, and rejoice that you're sharing Christ's sufferings, and that you may also rejoice when he is glorified, or that you also may rejoice and be glad when he is glorified, his glory is revealed. And talking about if you are insulted for the name of Christ and so on, that those things, I would imagine that those are probably a couple different things. One is that, similar to what Christ said, is that do not be surprised that the world will hate you, or if the world hates you because it first hated me. So that would be where the suffering comes in. But also I would imagine that it's that if you are being obedient to Christ, that you give Satan more of a reason to come after you. And so if you don't have that trial or that challenge, then maybe he's not, as they call it, threatened by you. Maybe he has no reason to make things more difficult because you're not giving him anything worth concerning over.
I see that could be a way, but I think it's more of just at times of people in that time period that being a Christian was definitely not viewed as good by society standards. And some people who probably thought that being Christian would be sometimes a society benefit are probably questioning it because they're like, the God of the universe is on my side. Why is this happening? And you have people who are against Christianity, and it seems like in ways that wouldn't be directly against them, against Christianity, and they're just like, well, this doesn't look like it's attacking Christ, it's looking like it's attacking me.
So are you saying that it's the type of thing where it doesn't feel like it's attacking Christ, it feels like it's attacking me, but we're getting it confused and thinking it's more personal whenever it's really actually aimed at Christ and we're just taking it the wrong way?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's with them interacting with people around them and the trials and sufferings there.
Well, I think also, usually, I think when Christ was mentioning it, that it is also the type of thing of him trying to put his followers at ease, because they feel like they're being personally attacked. And he's like, just so you know, it's not actually because of you, it's because of me. So it's like kind of taking a burden off of them, and which I guess is might be kind of an odd way of looking at it, because you're still feeling it, but at least you're not feeling it because of something you actually did, but it's because of how they are reacting to Christ.
Yeah. I can probably say, like, in probably modern times, that can feel like good, because a lot of people, if they try to interact as Christians, interact with non-believers, they find this time of that they're being pushed out socially.
Mm-hmm.
And that this part that it's not you that is being pushed out, it's because of your Christian beliefs. If you're not being pushed out for your Christian beliefs, it's you. I just have to say that there's a difference between you and following Christ, and
Right.
for it. And you see that later on, as Peter will be like, if you do these sort of things, murderer, thief, evildoer, meddler, like those, that's a list of hey, if you're saying you're suffering for Christ and you do these things, this is not them attacking you for Christ. This is other things that they're attacking you for, the sins that you're doing.
Yeah, I guess it's also just, why would he mention those things? Because those seem almost like obvious that if you're being accused of those things, or if you're suffering because of having done those things, then that's not because of Christ. It's like, well, that would seem obvious, because those are clearly sinful. So why is he mentioning that?
I wonder if it's the idea that if you're a Christian, you are forgiven of your sins, but you're not, you still have to face the consequences of it here on earth, of your sin. So if this idea that, oh, if I'm a Christian, these things won't be held against me anymore. But if you're somebody who's stolen something, murdered something, gossiped, or done evil things, that you are still going to face the consequences of having to do of what you did in the past. If you're having to deal with those, like, you're not, we don't have it as a system that if you change what you believe, crimes and pain that you suffer to others is taken away. In a way of crimes in the society setting. With God, you are forgiven, but in society, you're not. You haven't been redeemed yet in the society.
But it says, let none of you suffer that way. If you haven't been redeemed in that way in society, wouldn't you suffer that way?
You have not been redeemed? What, say that again?
You said that the thing is, you have not been redeemed from that in society.
Yeah.
But if it says, but let none of you suffer as these things, wouldn't that suggest that doesn't that not make sense with this? It's suggesting that, or it sounds like you're saying that you will probably still suffer this way because you are not redeemed in society. And this, it says, let none of you suffer for these things.
So that is a go for other titles that you have. What other identifying things? So it's, even though it says let none of you suffer as a murderer or thief or an evildoer or as a meddler, it's more of the connotation of, if you are going to suffer under Christ. If you're going to suffer as a murderer, thief, or evildoer, meddler, it's calling more of the not to do those things or not be those things. Because if they're suffering under those, they're not suffering under Christ.
Right, okay. Yeah, I guess it looks like it's another way of saying, do not, if for whatever reason you have the temptation to do this stuff, basically don't. Do not give don't give into this stuff so that way you do not suffer for this stuff.
It's
But
well,
instead, but it said, but if you do suffer, suffer as a Christian.
yeah, it's kind of how we would put the connotation of wages.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if what you do as a Christian, what you do, not a Christian, say you're a carpenter, whatever you do as a carpenter, your wages for your work should be that. And if you're a murderer, the wages are what you get for being a murderer. One is, as wages would be standing in a society of like, hey, I get a business, I get to do work. And wages as a murderer would be, I will have to be criminally charged as a murderer. And it's, I think, similar connotation with the suffering of, if you're suffering as a carpenter, you'd be like, well, my hands are going to hurt all the time working at the working with wood. I would have splinters. And that would be the same sort of thing as a suffering, as this, what sort of comes along with being a carpenter as well as a murderer or thief.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the same way for here, that he doesn't want you to be suffering in those acts or persons.
I mean, it's also possible that it's Peter's way of saying, do not confuse your suffering as one of these things, as suffering as a Christian. Because there's types of the people who are at least possibly Christian, but have bad behavior, and then whenever people are
Get called out.
Whenever people are speaking ill of them because of this, they will basically, like even today, they will say that, oh, this is all happening just because I'm a Christian. That this is my way. This is how I am being persecuted. This is how I'm suffering for Christ. And at that point, it's like, no, you are actually doing stuff you're not supposed to be doing. So
Yeah.
And so I think that's probably along those lines. I mean, the odd thing is that these seem like extreme examples of that. It's like, why would you confuse being a murderer for I'm suffering for Christ? I could see perhaps a meddler, maybe a thief, maybe, but a murderer just seems like it's almost like over the top. Like, obviously, if you're murdering, then you're not, and people are getting onto you for that. It'd be hard to think that you would make the excuse of, oh, that I'm suffering because of Christ and stuff like that. That's like, that doesn't even make any sense. But it isn't there. That's why I find some of the things that they list as odd. But I could see it as a sense of them blaming the fact that they're a Christian, and therefore they're being persecuted for their faith because of how people are responding to them. And it's like, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean and just because you're a Christian does not automatically mean you're being persecuted when people are calling you out for stuff. Yeah. It really depends on how are you behaving. If you're actually behaving in a way that God considers righteous, and then they're still calling you out just for that, then yeah, that's persecution. Or that's close to persecution. You're suffering for Christ, but anything else is just like, no, that's not what that's talking about, or that's not how that would work. Yeah. You gave into sin, you have to deal with the consequences.
Yeah, I think if Peter is probably covering like a few bases here of the people who are like, the first part is, I'm doing good, why am I suffering? And Peter's like, this is to be expected. And then the people who are in suffering, but they're saying it's Christ when it's actually themselves, is the two responses for what kind of responses in suffering right there. And also Peter is making sure that you don't have somebody who's going to be prideful, be like, look, I'm suffering for Christ, but he's actually suffering for his own actions, so people don't praise him up. To be like, oh, look, he's such a strong Christian, he's suffering in these ways, but it's actually his own actions that are causing him to suffer in ways that aren't Christ-like, but praising it as Christ's suffering.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I guess it could be another way of like also with him saying, don't be surprised when these trials come at you. He's letting them know not to be surprised by that. But don't get that confused with if you do actually commit legit sins, that you will suffer for those. Don't confuse those two things.
Mm-hmm.
And but if you suffer as a Christian, or then he reverts back to, but if you suffer as a Christian, don't be ashamed of it. So basically, don't get just because I'm saying that you're going to deal with. Don't be surprised that you're going to deal with trials that test you. Don't get that mistaken for if you're dealing with a trial because you have sinned.
Yeah.
So don't get those things mixed up. And so I guess in that sense, it could be also like they would consider it a strange thing because they're like, well, I'm doing things right, so why am I dealing with struggles? It's like, well, no, don't expect that. Or you should expect that because Christ did, but just don't get that mixed up with, if you sin, that you're going to deal with trials, because that's a different kind of trial that you're dealing with. That's different kind of suffering.
Yeah, that is the suffering of dealing with your actions and God correcting you in that way, as compared to suffering your trials for Christ, because you're following Christ. There's a difference between them.
So yeah, I guess that's essentially him just saying there are distinctions with suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And don't be suffering for the wrong ones.
So, coming down to verse 17. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. If it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And the righteous are scarcely saved, will become of the ungodly and the sinners. For my kind of thoughts right there are a way of looking at ourselves of that with God's judgment of how holy it is, that the righteous can barely be saved, that we shouldn't have in ourselves this idea that I'm better than somebody else, because even the righteous can barely be saved, and they're scarcely saved. And I think of where it's in Ezekiel, where God says there were 3 righteous people.
3 righteous people?
3 righteous people, in Ezekiel, where God goes, you have Daniel, you have Job, and you have Noah in Ezekiel.
Where's that in Ezekiel?
Let me go look it up. Ezekiel 14:14. Okay, cells. Sorry for those listening. Just the microphone. Even if these 3 men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they would deliver it, but their own lives by their righteousness, declares the Lord.
They would deliver but their own lives by their righteousness. So when the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, when a land sins against me by acting faithlessly, and I stretch out my hand against it and break its supply of bread and send famine upon it, and cut off from it man and beast, even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they would deliver but their own lives by their righteousness, declares the Lord God.
Well, that for me is my view, the idea of how hard it is to be righteous if Daniel, Noah, and Job are the standard of humanly possible righteousness.
And it's only delivering their own lives.
Doesn't it say the lands?
No, it says if they were in it, they would deliver but their own lives by their righteousness.
Go back. So, Son of man, when a land sins against me by acting faithless, and I stretch out my hand against it, and break a supply of bread and send famine upon it, and cut it off from man and beast, even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they would deliver but their own lives by their righteousness. Oh yeah, it's just them. But
And this whole section it keeps on referring to them, saying that if I were to do this to these in this situation or that situation, they wouldn't be saving everyone else just by theirs, just be them. It's what it's suggesting in this is how bad things are.
yeah.
That they can't, because usually you can pray for. Usually God would ask a righteous person to be praying for the repentance of a nation, and it makes it sound like in this situation, even if they did pray, it would just be their lives that would be saved. It's that bad.
Yeah. But so I'm still for the standard of righteousness. I'd say right here, if righteousness is scarcely saved, and those Noah, Job, and Daniel are the standard of righteousness, by how much does humanly righteousness would possibly be worth saving if that seems to be the earthly standard of not holy but possibly acceptable.
Well, when I was looking this up, because I was trying to figure out, it looks like this is referencing, at least the way it's laid out in my Bible, it looks like it's that if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? It's looking like it's quoting something, which on here it looks like it's quoting early in the reference. It looks like it's saying Proverbs 11:31, which when I was looking it up, it may be a paraphrase. It didn't really look like it was actually. It's not like it was word for word at all. It was like, well, that's an interesting way of suggesting that's the passage. 31. That's what I'm getting mixed up.
Yep.
Let's see. Yeah, so that says, if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? And in Proverbs 11:31, it says, if the righteous is repaid on earth, how much more the wicked and the sinner?
11:31. Going a lot of back and forth in this one. Right here. I'm sorry, I hit the thing again. The righteous is repaid on earth. How much more the wicked and the sinner? That's an interesting paraphrase.
It is.
For it. So the my question is, did we get is the notes referring to the correct one is my thought.
Mm-hmm.
For what he's going for.
So in the notes on mine, I'm not reading all of it. I mean, I read all of it, but it didn't. thing that sticks out to me is when it says scarcely saved, does not mean that the righteous just barely receive salvation. Scarcely, in this language, with difficulty, means that the righteous are saved in the midst of suffering. Their salvation is not easy and simple.
So practically, it's like being saved, but you survived a train crash. You
Basically,
you're not.
it was rough, but we got it.
We got it out right here. You might have broken several ribs right here, and you're going to be taken to the hospital because if you don't get your treatment now, you're not going to make it.
Which is kind of interesting because in verse 17 it says, For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And that's when it quotes that passage.
Because I'm wondering what sort of like judgment it is, because the part I think of is there's the judgment of like would be like the rapture, or where you're going between who's in the book of life and who's not in the book of life. And then after that, for those who are believers, I forget the name of the seat where your works are put on trial by like fire, where your bad works will burn away and what's good will survive, of what will be carried over into the new heaven and the new earth. Part of me thinks of that, but I wonder if it's a different sort of judgment.
Well, it says that I'm not specifically sure about that, but it does say, it says that for it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, so it's suggesting that when it says it begins with the household of God, that it's referring to, I guess, it begins with the believers first.
Mm-hmm.
It says, and what will be the outcome of those who do not obey the gospel? And thus it says, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner if it's difficult for the righteous to be saved? If they're going to go through a lot of hardship, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner?
Yeah. Part of me also wonders if it's like the judgment that God brings like to the nation of Israel, how we talked about earlier of Ezekiel, how it got so bad that like God's judgment on them could not be saved even by those three. But here it's more of how God would punish Israel and like judges, or in the kingdom of Israel, where he would let other nations take over Israel and Judah. And that's with his ways of judgment, that he will go for Israel. He will judge his people. He mentions in like the Old Testament about judgments and such of other countries and nations and kingdoms, but he also deals with Israel, and he always seems to deal with Israel first before dealing with other nations that are sinning.
All right, so here, you could be onto something. It says in the note, it says that the judgment begins with the household of God, alludes to Ezekiel 9:1-6 and Malachi 3:1-4. The 9:1-6. It says, Then he cried in my ears with a loud voice, saying, Bring near the executioners of the city, each with his destroying weapon in his hand. Behold, 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north, each with his weapon for slaughter in his hand. And with them was a man clothed in linen, with a writing case at his waist. And they went in and stood beside the bronze altar. Now the glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherub on which it rested to the threshold of the house. And he called to the man clothed in linen, who had the writing case at his waist. And the Lord said to him, Pass through the city, through Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it. And to the others he said in my hearing, Pass through the city after him, and strike your eye, and strike. Your eye shall not spare. Yeah, your eye shall not spare, and you shall show no pity. Kill old men outright, young men and maidens, little children and women, but touch no one on whom is the mark, and begin at my sanctuary. So they began with the elders who were before the house. Okay, so
kind of a serious judgment on those who are of Israel who are believers, that this sort of judgment from God comes upon, and for this judgment is here on earth. And so if this judgment is barely saving those who are righteous in a way of suffering, how is it for those who are sinning?
Can you repeat that?
So for where God's judgment starts, he starts with the believers, and how the judgment will affect those who are doing righteous, but it would also affect the righteous, but it also will affect those who are sinning. And how will the judgment be if those who are doing righteous will also suffer in the judgment? How much will the suffering be for those who are sinning?
Right. Yeah, the difference that I'm seeing on here, it does look like it. Yeah, it's suggesting that it will be painful for the righteous, like you were saying, but it will be way more difficult for the ungodly.
Yeah.
Because another thing it mentions in here, it says the suffering, and the notes for that, it says the suffering of God's people refines them. What will be the outcome? If the people of God need purifying, then surely the judgment of those who do not obey the gospel will be much more severe.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it's showing that it will, and that's part of, I guess, why it'd be difficult for the righteous, because they're still going to be experiencing the pain of the refinement, or the pain of having to get rid of the filth that's in our lives. But for the unrighteous, there's nothing good to refine, and so it's just going to be painful. There's nothing good to come out of it.
I think good will come out of it. It's just
For the
how much
for the ungodly and the sinner.
Yeah, it was kind of saying like, hey, if I have a rock and I'm trying to get the gold out of it,
Mm-hmm.
and I have the righteous where you can be like, oh, look, there's a lot of gold. You can just see in the rock, there's a lot of gold, and compared to a rock that doesn't have much gold, how much more is that fire going to be needed to get all the purify the gold for the one that has you can see a lot of the gold compared to the one that doesn't have a lot of gold?
But that's not what it's saying.
Yeah.
Because by the illustration you're giving, what that would be suggesting is that everyone has a little bit of good inside of them. And at least that little bit of good will be saved, whether or not you're a believer.
I'm talking about for a believer.
Right. So what I'm saying
but this
here,
one's going for those who do not obey.
Yeah, it says that it'll still be very difficult for the righteous. That's why it says scarcely saved. It just means that because of refinement, there's going to be a lot that's going to be burned away because of the sin.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because it's only going to leave the good, and so that will be difficult enough for them. But for the unrighteous, those who do not believe, if it's going to be that difficult for the righteous, there's no chance for the sinner. There's no chance for someone who doesn't obey the gospel, or who is not who's ungodly and a sinner.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I was thinking a completely different situation.
Right, yeah.
right there. My thought was more of towards like, hey, like you have a church, and say like the leadership is sinning, and you have the congregation that's following along, doing that sin. You have a few in the people who are there who are trying to call it out. And then it gets exposed of what the leadership is doing. Like the people, it hurts the church's ministry right there. And the righteous people in there are caught up in the same sort of suffering as those who were not obeying. Right there. And so the righteous will come out hurt, and barely making by, but you have those who were not listening, who weren't seeing what was going on, and they got caught up in it. It's like the person who, between like unwittingly compliant into it or ignoring compliance, you're just deciding to ignore what was going on, versus the person who's actively in the church being like trying to call it out, how it's for those people.
Trying to also, in a sense, make sense out of this aspect of it, the 17, 18, with the rest of, I guess, the paragraph, 12 to 19, trying to see how, because it's talking about don't be surprised by your trials, but don't also mistake actual sin for suffering for Christ. And do not be ashamed whenever you do suffer for Christ.
Mm-hmm.
But that says, for it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. So it almost is making out like the judgment that it says, for it is time for judgment to begin. It's almost as if like what we're dealing with now is the judgment of God. Like this judgment has been ongoing since people became believers. This judgment has been ongoing to the extent of whenever you're dealing with trials, it's just Christ purifying you.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, then it says, but what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Because it says, it says, what will be the outcome of for those who do not obey? Or it says, if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God?
Yeah. I wonder if it's with the part of fiery trials of that is the purification process, and so the trials that God uses to build up your faith is also possibly a test of judgment as well.
It's almost as if what this is suggesting is that you'll have both believers and unbelievers dealing with the same trials. However, the believer should come out of it with a stronger faith, with having leaned into Christ more, and so building up their faith and maturing them. Whereas whenever the unbeliever is going through this thing, all it does is they just dive deeper into that sin.
Mm-hmm.
And almost like, there's essentially nothing good that comes out of this trial, because there's nothing to purify. That's what it seems like this is referring to, is that all the stuff that they're talking about in 12 to 19, that 17 and 18 is basically saying that both will be dealing with the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
but there's going to be different results coming out. There should be different results coming out for each group,
Yeah.
which I have never heard this before.
Yeah.
Or at least never heard it being put this way before. Mainly like in sermons and stuff like that. Just that we're all going through the same thing, but for Christians, it's well, I guess usually how it's put is that we all everyone is going through the same thing, but for Christians, there's a different purpose behind it. That usually God uses it to help to refine them for those who are not Christians, or who don't follow Christ. It's not there to refine. It's really not there to refine them. It's just a hardship that they're dealing with in general, and
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't do anything it doesn't help them, and so they won't make it out alive. Whereas a Christian will, but it will be difficult. Someone who's not Christian is not going to make it out alive. It's just going to be pain.
Yeah. I wonder if this is more of the aspect of society in sin and righteousness as well. Because sin can also be individual sin, but also society sin, as
Mm-hmm.
well as them just being like, you know what, murder is legal, or like that, and be like, they view the society has deemed something as good, but God has said this is wrong,
Mm-hmm.
and society itself will suffer because God's judgment is on a larger scale for it than just individual.
That is what that Ezekiel passage was saying. Was that the righteous people saw the wicked and were wept over it, and because of the weeping, God put a mark on them, so that way when destruction did come upon the place, they were not touched.
Yeah.
I think it was like they still had the experience of all the judgment around them, but they themselves didn't feel that judgment. They just dealt with all the chaos that was surrounding them.
Yeah. And so this is probably a sense of, if it's a larger group, society, or judgment right there, that of God bringing it there, that the Christians will barely make it through. Well, those who don't obey God will, like, what will happen to them because they did not.
Right. It's almost like they won't survive.
Mm-hmm.
In the same sense, I'm meaning like they will literally no longer exist.
I'm thinking. So, what I'm thinking right now is maybe might be the closest example is at the end of World War II. And you have like the trials of all like the Nazi Germany, and for it you find those throughout the trials that even though they were part of the society were actively against it, viewing it as wrong. And afterwards you see that they were spared and more of their names are like known of those who had like who did not commit the acts or fought against it, who survived the day of judgment even though they were part of the society.
But this is making it out as if they will endure some sort of.
They did endure some sort of suffering during the time in Germany and right at the end when you would say the judgment was coming right there, and then during the trial of like the last days of the war, them being captured, and then judgment came.
What did they deal with? What hardships did they deal with in the judgment?
So they were put into prison just with the fellow SS officers. And they had the reviling done to them as well. It wasn't until they stood up in the court and then that witnesses came up to testify about what they did, righteous or unrighteous. And so those who are righteous, that was the moment of they were suffering before the time came for judgment under the Allies' control. And then when the judgment came, they barely made it by, because what happens if you're found guilty? You get killed because of the atrocities that you did. And so they barely made it by, in the sense of if nobody showed up, they would be killed.
What do you think is the point of this, of the chronological aspect of this thing? If it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? Why would it be important to say if it begins with us?
Begins with us.
I feel like it also deals with what you were just talking about as a comparison. But it deals with it in the sense of also maybe it doesn't correlate well enough. I'm not sure.
That's not the best example. But it's the one I can think is closest to us that could be similar enough. But
I just also do find this kind of an interesting thing that says if it begins with us, it's almost as if. Well, I don't know if it says it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. If it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not believe the gospel? It's almost because the judgment they're saying that they will be dealing with the judgment first. So I guess that's an interesting thing, because the way they're wording it, it's like it will begin with us, so we will be dealing with a ton of it, or the brunt of it first. But then, what will be the outcome for those who do not believe or do not obey?
I think for it's one of those things that God, with it, when he aims for the correction, he aims at the church first. That with like Israel, get Israel corrected first. Get the church corrected first. If it doesn't happen if the church has to go through the pain of being purified, And there's not anything for the unbelievers when the fire comes to test them. Like,
I guess that would make sense with what it's saying. If the righteous is scarcely saved, it's like if it's going to be difficult in a similar situation, if it starts with us and if it's going to be difficult for us,
mm-hmm.
then how are they going to come out of it?
Mm-hmm.
How is the other side? How is the other people going to come out of it? They're not.
Yeah. Maybe like slavery in America is a better example of them arguing over slavery of like, is it right or wrong? And then you have the church go like it was like tearing churches apart during like the early 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
But when it came across that the church was like, okay, slavery is wrong. And then for those who were like, no, I'm not going to follow this. When the Civil War came, there was suffering for those who were not willing to follow Christ in the way of like saying that slavery is wrong. And we had the Civil War over it.
Mm-hmm.
But it first started out in the church, that right there of the judgment. And then we can go to the verses of the last verse in chapter 4. Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. So, part of me goes that some people will probably try to go for reasoning here of like, so if God's will is for me to suffer, why should I trust the person who's causing me suffering? Well, that is the question of that probably I think people would have of if they read this verse.
Oh, you mean like, so why should they trust God if he's the one causing the suffering?
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Because I think I've heard a thing of where people like in like public schools have read like Psalm 23 and just be like, okay, what is your opinions of it? And it's just interesting of them being like, why would I want to lie in a green pasture? And we'd be like, we understand like the context of what God is saying of like, he will lead us to peace. Or they say like, why am I a sheep? I don't want to be dumb. But as a Christian, you're like, yeah, we are sheep when it comes to God because we are sinful. But here, if you're like a non-believer asking the question of why would I trust God, where it says here, who suffer according to God's will and trust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. If God and Creator are the same, why am I trusting God when I'm suffering under his will?
Right. And so it looks like this whole section 12 to 17 is supposed to, all of that is to, this is like the conclusion to, or the, what do you call it? It's
the therefore.
He's making, he's
the therefore.
Right. It's like all this stuff is because of this. And so what? So yeah, it says, so therefore let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to Him. As he's making the case with the rest of this stuff of saying, yes, you're going to be dealing with suffering, fiery trials for refinement. And then it says in verse 13, but rejoice insofar as you share in Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. And so part of the reason why you would entrust your souls to him, that he's doing good, is that in the end you'll be able to rejoice and be able to enjoy enjoy the glory that is revealed in Christ.
Mm-hmm.
That's what all the suffering is for. It's still to enjoy that in the end.
Mm-hmm.
So trust that he knows. So trust that he knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
What I find interesting is he calls himself creator.
I think for it to give the idea that he's in control, give them that they don't go to idols or go to anybody else to be like, well, sure, it's God, but God's not in charge of the weather, so I'll go to Zeus, or I'll go to Apollos, where Peter is saying, no, it's the creator, so you don't go to anybody else, because the person who creates is also in charge of everything.
The person who makes things knows how to make you correctly.
Yes. But I'm also looking at the part where it says, while doing good. I view that as Peter is saying here, you might be suffering for God. You'll be suffering for God's will.
Mm-hmm.
Even though you are entrusting yourself to God, you are supposed to be doing good. So if you find yourself being like, think of it as an excuse that I can respond the way I want to respond, how I want things to be. Peter's going, no, there's a behavior that you're supposed to do. If, say, somebody wrongs you, you're still supposed to be doing good in response to it. And if you're not doing good, you're not entrusting your soul to God. If you're saying, I can do whatever I want if something's bad's happening to you.
Right. Because another way I could see is that if they're entrusting their souls to him, that also means that trusting suggests that they do believe that he's doing good.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would be, you would see that as being a reason to continue yourself to be doing good because you already trust that he's doing good. However, it could also be the type of thing where you are entrusting him with your soul that he's doing good, but you're holding on to that trust by a thread because of whatever's going on. So it can still be difficult. So you're kind of still could be having a bad mood and behaving poorly, but you're like, well, he says it's, I'm entrusting him, but it's type of thing where I am entrusting him with this, but it's still a very shaky situation, a very harsh situation. So it's almost like a barely trusting, but I am still trusting him. And because of that, you could still be behaving poorly because it's still a struggle in trusting him. And so that could be why Peter is trying to clarify. He's like, don't just entrust your soul to him. Also be sure you are having, like you said, having a good attitude, doing good while doing this. And don't just basically be technically trusting him.
Yeah.
So there's more to it than just that. Or you should be handling it better than just that.
I'm thinking a bit with it of like, hey, I'm having this stuff happen to me. Have this trial for my faith. And then as you're being tested, being on trial for it by God, as you're being suffering, you you're supposed to respond in kind, to be like, hey, this person that's causing this suffering to me, I've got to do good to them, be like helping them. But if I'm responding in the same way they are responding, of like, you've caused me suffering, so I'm going to cause you suffering in the same way, then you aren't, I would say, like doing what God wants you, and you're not entrusting God's will, that you are entrusting in God as a faithful creator for the situation. You're responding and taking things into your own matter. You're not trusting God to take care of it.
Right. I do see how that would fall into that. I don't. It's not saying that exactly, but I can see how that would still fall. That would still fall under that situation. Would still fall under this, even though there's not talking about that exactly. I think this is just saying in general, where you're suffering, still do good, not specifically. If there's a specific someone who's causing you harm, still do good to them.
Yeah.
It's not saying that specifically, but it would still fall. I can see it still falling under that.
Yeah. For it, I think that would probably be for this section right here.